Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mary Price and I'm the Events and Marketing Director at the Shingo Institute at Utah State University. And I'm pleased to have Mark Graban with us today. You may know Mark from his popular podcast, My Favorite Mistake. Mark recently received the Shingo Publication Award for his book, The Mistakes That Make Us, which was inspired from the podcast. And we're recognizing him at the 37th Annual Shingo Conference, which will be held next week in Provo, Utah. If you haven't registered for it, I would encourage you to come. We would love to see you and have you join us. Um, and then also last week, we published an article in our newsletter, which was written by Mark, and it's called Psychological Safety, the Foundation for Lean and Continuous Improvement, which is what our topic is today. And you can find that article by visiting our website. It's at shingo.org/articles. And with that, Mark, thanks so much for being here, and I'll turn the time over to you.
Okay, Mary. Well, thank you, and thanks to the Shingo Institute for the opportunity today. We've got limited time. I'm going to try to keep my remarks and slides to about 20 minutes so we can do some Q&A and discussion afterwards. But I hope to make the case that psychological safety is the foundation, or at least a major foundation for the Toyota production system, lean management, continuous improvement, whatever we may call that. A set of the slides and the polling results and other links and resources will be available at markgraban.com/Shingo 2025, and we'll put that URL up again at the end. And at 3 different points here, we're going to do some anonymous polling. So I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to scan that QR code on your phone or mobile device, and it'll bring up a welcome screen that will advance to the polling, or you can go to menti.com and enter the code 17851466, and that'll come up on screen again during the polling. So I want to start with, I think, the core definition of psychological safety, because I think as we may have run across, people hear the word lean or the phrase lean management or something like it, and they decide, I know what that means. And what they decide they think that means is maybe not the same as the core definitions that we would use of lean, and the same thing happens around psychological safety. So I'm going to cite and give credit to one of the leading voices in this whole field, Amy Edmondson, a professor at Harvard Business School. Her books, including The Fearless Organization and Right Kind of Wrong, are great. She defines psychological safety as a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with things including, but I would say not limited to, ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. It's an individual belief. We could say that it's a perception, or it's even a feeling of how safe do I feel speaking up, where speaking up is going to be worthwhile and something that doesn't put me at the risk of professional or personal harm, punishment of some form. Now, there are direct references to this concept of psychological safety in the book Toyota Culture that was co-written by Jeff Liker and Mike Hoseas. And as it says in the book, kind of related to this idea of feeling safe to speak up, quoting from the book, without trust in their employers, employees are reluctant to admit to the existence of problems and learn that it is safest to hide them. I started my career at General Motors. It'll be 30 years ago in June. That was not an environment of high psychological safety. And I've got countless stories of people literally hiding problems, hiding defects, pallets of bad parts behind construction curtains. It was not an environment where it was generally safe to speak up. And people find this to be a challenge, unfortunately, in healthcare. But thankfully, some people are working on it. So pictured here, this was one of my visits to Japan in 2018, a hospital that was fairly near Toyota's headquarters in Nagoya, and they were getting some direct coaching from Toyota. And Dr. Yasuda, pictured here, she's their chief medical officer, or at least was at the time. You can see a chart, and she's smiling and proud that the number of incident reports was increasing pretty steadily, especially in those last 6 years. Now, I think when we see a chart labeled number of incident reports, we want to be careful that in distinguishing that the number of incident reports might not be as high as the number of actual incidents. So as we're working on kind of strengthening a sense of psychological safety, the first step is speaking up in reporting incidents so that we can then address them. And there's, of course, an incredibly strong and consistent culture of this at Toyota. And one, I guess, manifestation of that is, of course, the andon cord. This cultural idea that if you have made a mistake, if you see a problem, if you see a defect, if you have a concern, the expectation is that you would reach up and pull the andon cord. And this is really, I think, described as an andon system, because what happens when somebody pulls the cord, within seconds, a team leader is there, not threatening to punish somebody for potentially stopping the line, but to ask, what's the problem? What can we do to help? But sadly, copying the equipment and the hardware of the andon cord and the chimes and the lights and everything doesn't mean that the tool is going to have the same effect. There was a fascinating article on the BBC website going back to 2007 talking about, in part, the andon system at Toyota and the andon equipment that had been installed in a new Ford truck plant in my home state of Michigan. And as the article described, at the Toyota plant, the andon cord was pulled roughly 2,000 times a week. I had a chance to go to the Toyota Georgetown plant about 2 months ago, and as usual, almost constantly, you hear the sounds and you see the sights of the andon cord being pulled somewhere almost constantly, and you see the team leaders coming to react. So one thing I've learned, and I think being part of environments with low psychological safety and environments with high psychological safety, that speaking up, using our voice, isn't a matter of character or courage. It's a function of culture. I'm sure if you took somebody from a Toyota plant, let's say they had to move to another state because of their family and a job, and they were in a factory that had the andon cord but didn't have the andon cord culture, they might learn very quickly that in that workplace, it's not safe to speak up the way they had someplace else. So whether we see an environment where the andon cord isn't being pulled, if we see huddle boards or Kaizen boards that aren't being used, I think we can ask why. And it's fair to ask, well, why would people choose to keep quiet? And I think that's an important framing. It's not shame on you for not speaking up. Again, it's not a matter of character or courage. It's a choice, and they might be doing so to protect themselves and their job and their paycheck. So Ethan Burris, a professor at the business school at the University of Texas, Austin, has found very consistent results surveying people across different industries and types of organizations. One reason people choose to keep quiet could be described as the fear factor, where people are afraid of being punished or marginalized or mocked or ridiculed for speaking up. But number one in the survey, just slightly higher than the fear factor, is another F word. And in this case, it's futility. We could call this a futility factor. And I've heard people in different workplaces, unfortunately, say things very directly like, I'm not afraid to speak up here. It's just not worth the effort. I've pointed out that problem so many times and nothing happens. It's not worth, I just don't speak up anymore. And if it's not a fear factor, if we've eliminated that pretty well through psychological safety, we need to, of course, also work on the futility factor. And we'll come back to that in a second. So let's do our first poll. You can go to menti.com and use the code 17851466, or I can put the Q. Well, okay, we're getting a lot of votes. So we're getting a lot of votes for futility. We're getting we're getting even more votes for fear and futility. Thankfully, so far, 11 people are saying that there are no barriers to speaking up. That would be the ideal. But when I do this survey in different settings and recently in Australia and New Zealand, the results were pretty similar, where futility or the combination of fear and futility usually far outrank the combination of fear alone. So we need to work on this as leaders and in our culture. So thank you, and I'll share the final results of the polling on the website later today. So when you think about and-on polls or participation in continuous improvement or participation in catchball and Hoshin Connery, I think there are two main things that are required. There's that foundation of psychological safety. How safe do we feel to speak up? And then we need effective problem solving. Now, I've seen a lot of organizations in lean and operational excellence circles that have invested so much time and effort and money into problem solving training. But then they see, well, it seems people aren't pointing out problems. We don't have a lot of problem solving taking place. And arguably, it would be poor problem solving to double down on more problem solving training. That might not be the constraint at all. The constraint might be the level of psychological safety in the workplace. So we need both. Now, thinking back to that hospital in Japan, there's similar data that I've seen shared by a health system in the Pacific Northwest of the US. They had an andon cord inspired system that they called safety stops. They did not literally hang andon cords above patient beds and operating room tables, but they were working on the cultural elements of speaking up and getting a constructive response. And you can see this increase in reported events or risks or situations. That's the first step. But we don't want psychological safety and people feeling safe alone reporting the same problems over and over again. We need problem solving, and we need to address and prevent recurrence. And here's the second chart that I think matters even more. Not just an increase in reports, but a statistically significant reduction in serious safety events and harms to patients, about a 50% reduction over the course of 12 months. It's a function of culture. Back to the book Toyota Culture, quoting Leiker and Hoseas again, it says pretty directly, Toyota believes people must feel psychologically and physically safe. They must believe that any concerns they have will be taken seriously. And to me, that points to the two pieces, the two PSs, psychological safety and problem solving. It's not just feeling safe to speak up, but taken very seriously means we respond, we do problem solving, we try to prevent the recurrence of that problem. Recently, I learned about a book that was published in Japan late 2023, I believe. And thanks to the power of AI tools, I've been able to, quote unquote, read the book as a translation. And this book is very directly pointing to Toyota efforts in Japan to very directly focus on strengthening the sense of psychological safety, especially amongst younger employees working in their digital transformation efforts. So I think it's interesting and not surprising to me. It's intuitive that there would be a high sense of psychological safety in an organization like Toyota. And it's great to see how they are specifically focusing on that. But we'll come back to the question of how do we cultivate a sense of psychological safety? It cannot be mandated. It cannot be directed. The sense of psychological safety that we feel or do not feel, the degree that we feel safe, is a function of the interactions we're having with our leaders and other people in the workplace. So a couple of things that do not work would be mandates or directives such as, well, you should speak up. People decide on their own how safe they feel. I've seen in healthcare sometimes it's stated a little more strongly, like, well, it's your professional obligation to speak up. And like, yeah, I don't think guilt tripping people is really that effective. Declaring things like this is a safe space, that doesn't work either. It's not the space that's safe. It's people who decide how safe they feel based on the interactions they're having with others. So here's what actually works. There are 3 high-level countermeasures that leaders and colleagues can practice and exhibit that help build and strengthen the sense of psychological safety. The first one is leaders modeling the behaviors that they want to see. You could call this modeling candor. Speaking frankly, you could call this modeling vulnerability, where vulnerability means basically, are you exposing yourself to some sort of risk of loss or harm. That could be vulnerability could mean you're exposing yourself to the risk of being punished, or maybe you think you're exposing yourself to the risk of people thinking less of you. So modeling those behaviors, encouraging others to follow their lead, and then when people do take that chance of rewarding their candor. So even at a software company like KaiNexus, where I've been involved, the CEO leads by example. As Greg said in the podcast, I don't have a problem talking about my mistakes. And in many workplace settings, Greg is the first to say things like, I don't know, I was wrong, let's go test that, let's go find out. He's speaking humbly and candidly. So then employees that work for him um, would follow that lead. So here's a picture from an all hands meeting where we have a habit of not just saying what went well, but also talking about what went wrong. And as you see pictured here, Chris is talking in plain language. I made mistakes. He talked about those mistakes. He talked about what he learned and what he was going to do differently. And that becomes a habit within the company that you see exhibited on an ongoing basis, sharing mistakes for the sake of others learning and for setting a good example. So one of Chris's employees at the time, Stephanie, posted a comment on LinkedIn about how she thought she had a significant failure, and everybody rallied around her instead of pointing fingers. All they said was, "We learned." It encouraged me to continue trusting them with my mistakes. And there's a long history of this at Toyota. I don't have time to tell the stories here, but Asao Yoshino, as documented in Katie Anderson's Shingo Award recipient book, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, told a story. And my friend David Meyer, who started at Kentucky, the Georgetown plant in the 1980s, they both have stories about making a mistake in a production area earlier in their career, and leadership realized that this was a process-based or a systemic problem. The focus was, and Mr. Yoshino was afraid he was going to be punished. If anything, leadership apologized to him for the systemic problem, putting him in that position. So there's a long history of reacting constructively to mistakes at Toyota. So when you think about our response or the way others respond to mistakes, and this is going to bring up our second polling question in a minute, I think there's roughly three types of responses or reactions to mistakes. One is punitive. And I would say this is in the red. This is what, the no good, the NG way of reacting. The punitive response does nothing but really teach people to get better at hiding and covering up mistakes. We're dooming ourselves to repeat the mistake if we've punished or fired somebody without addressing the system and the process that led to the mistake. But some organizations kind of over-index into kind of a yellow zone of a nice reaction to mistakes, where they're not being punitive, but they're saying things like, well, don't feel bad. I know you didn't mean to do it. It wasn't your fault. It was a systemic problem. And then maybe that's the end of the story. We might be dooming somebody to the same mistake happening again and getting the same nice response. Where I'll credit my friend Karen Ross for helping me understand better the difference between nice and kind. I think of kind as being constructive, where we're being non-punitive, but instead of just focusing on feelings and don't feel bad, we are taking actions that could be described as kind, of moving forward in problem solving and prevention. And so that's where I would like to do this next poll. In your workplace, what's the most likely reaction to mistakes in your workplace? And I've only done the survey one time where there were zero responses that said punitive, and that was a poll of about 40 people at an all hands meeting at that software company, KaiNexus. So in that setting where there is a high degree of psychological safety, nobody expected a punitive response, but as we're seeing here, there was a pretty even split between nice and kind, and I think that showed an opportunity there at KaiNexus if to move beyond just non-punitive and to focus more on kind and constructive. So we've got about 15 votes for punitive and a pretty even split of about 27 and 25 between nice and kind. So I'll give a shout out to Karen's book, The Kind Leader, if you want to learn more about that. So the final thing I want to touch on, and we'll do another poll, um, other than Amy Edmondson's great work, another key influence on me is Timothy R. Clark and his book, The Four Stages of Psychological Safety. And just to run through this real quickly, his research has shown that teams and organizations move through a pretty predictable progression. And in this, I love this, my engineer brain, my problem solving, we can break down this big fuzzy goal of psychological safety and give ourselves a little bit more of a progression to work through. So stage one is inclusion safety. Can I be my authentic self? Do I feel included, accepted, and respected by my team? If we are feeling good in that regard, well, then we can move to stage two, learner safety. Do I feel safe to learn and grow? Can I ask questions? Can I say, I don't know? Can I admit that I made a mistake so that we can learn from it? Stage three is what Clark calls contributor safety. Can I contribute and create value? Can I do my job without being micromanaged? And then if we feel that sense of safety, then we can move toward what I think everyone involved in continuous improvement is looking for. The pinnacle of psychological safety is feeling a sense of challenger safety. Can I be candid about change? Can I challenge the status quo? Can I bring ideas forward? Can I test ideas in kind of candid PDSA cycles without a sense of being punished? So let's do our final polling question that'll kind of help us touch on these four stages. And I'm going to ask everybody to please kind of vote on a 1 to 10 scale. How much do you agree at work? These four questions kind of map to the four stages. And so here are the responses. Now, typically the averages start a little bit higher for that stage one and decrease. We're not quite seeing that here today, but the one thing that I think is a general pattern is that the variation increases as we go down stages 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I think that's something to reflect upon. How safe do we feel across these four dimensions of psychological safety? And how safe do we think others feel in regard to speaking up in the workplace? So again, kind of final recap, psychological safety really means nothing more other than this question of how safe do I feel speaking up about problems, ideas, mistakes, improvement opportunities, and the like. So with that, I think we have about 6 minutes left for some Q&A, and I'm going to put this slide back up on screen. Again, if you want to get slides and the final polling results and more, you can go to markgraban.com/Shingo 2025.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mark. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask them in the chat or in the Q&A. We are looking at both of them. We do have a few minutes to answer some questions.
And I'm going to put the polling results back up. I had not done the final click that was necessary to put the screen sharing back up. So for all the webinars that I've done, I managed to make a mistake. So I'm going to put those polling results back up. So I'm going to just go ahead and read this one comment, Mary. Brandon said, I do believe some psychological safety is due to the individual. Some folks aren't worried about their culture when choosing to speak up. Well, yeah, I think that's true. The different things that affect each individual go beyond the workplace. There could be elements of national culture and where you're from, how much hierarchy is there. It could be due to our upbringing in school. It could be upbringing, or it could be our experience in previous workplaces. So, I've found that even in an organization that's got relatively low psychological safety, there's still always somebody who's willing to speak up, but that person might be fired and drummed out. And it doesn't mean that's going to scale well. So I think the three key countermeasure behaviors that help others feel more safe is ultimately a better way to go.
We do have lots of questions for you, Mark. So I'm okay staying on later if you'd like.
I am too.
Okay, great. So feel
I'll
free.
let you ask the questions. Go ahead. Sorry.
Perfect. So when an organization does this well, what are some of the intangibles seen?
What are some of the intangibles? Well, I mean, I think the observable behaviors. I mean, you can do psychological safety surveys. You could look at measures such as incident reports, safety reports, improvement ideas being implemented as a gauge of psychological safety. But I think some of the behaviors that you would see would be, people disagreeing with their manager in a meeting, and that being reacted to in a constructive way, not being ignored, not being just tolerated, but being rewarded. I think you would see. So I think it's an interesting. Sometimes it's only safe to ask as a rhetorical question. As a leader, do you remember the last time an employee disagreed with you? And if the answer is no, there might be a psychological safety problem, or it might be a futility factor. I think in an environment with psychological safety, it doesn't mean you get magic consensus, but it means people feel safe to disagree, and you would see the behaviors of people debating the merits of an idea and following I think, for example, a good lean problem solving process of looking at data and gathering facts and going to the Gemba instead of the highest person's opinion winning the day. I think those are a couple of things you would see in an environment of psychological safety. And along with, again, I think leaders leading the way of saying key things like, I was wrong. I might be wrong. So let's go test that idea. I made a mistake. I don't know. What do you think? Inviting disagreement and dissent or some of the key behaviors.
I feel like this next question goes along just what you said as well. And they're asking how any guidance on how to get senior leaders to embrace psychological safety. And then along with that, we also have a question about how do you propose starting to shift the culture of an organization that's been used to firefighting
Mhm.
and not thinking of from a preventative action mindset. And I feel like those go hand in hand.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first question of how do you make the case? I mean, I think Amy Edmondson's research um, and other research has demonstrated that psychological safety, it's not just quote unquote the right way to treat people, that it leads to better business results. And I missed an opportunity to try to make that case in a really short presentation here. So if you can invite someone to read one of Amy Edmondson's HBR articles, if they're not willing to read the whole book, the New York Times had a great article about initiatives at Google called Project Aristotle, where Google was asking this big high level question of why are some teams more successful than others? And the key variable was basically the degree of psychological safety. All other things being equal, teams with a higher sense of psychological safety will improve more, they will innovate more, they will perform better. So there's that, kind of, I think, cold, hard business case that psychological safety is not just a nice to have, that it really is a foundation for improvement and world-class performance.
Absolutely.
And then the second question was about how do we change the habit? So around firefighting, that I think comes in to the dimension of problem solving, right? So you could have high psychological safety where people aren't afraid to report the fires. It's just the fires keep happening because the problem solving is ineffective. So that might be a situation where the bottleneck is the problem solving process or mindsets. And but I think there's one other component, one other thing could be happening when you think about plan, do, study, adjust cycles. And let me put up a visual real quick. I don't think people are familiar with these cycles. The plan and do requires psychological safety to speak up about a problem or a gap or a mistake. And then to do something, or I wish this word was really test. We test countermeasures, we test a hypothesis. And then if we don't have the psychological safety to say we tried something and it didn't work out as predicted, then there's really no adjustment. There's no PDSA cycles. So that might lead to ongoing firefighting because people say, "Hey, boss, we put the countermeasure in place. We know it was effective, and then it turns out not to be effective." And if people are pressured into justifying every attempted improvement as being a roaring success, that might lead to the continued firefighting. So I think there's ways psychological safety or the lack thereof pops up in a couple of different ways through PDSA cycles.
There's another question. They're asking, how do you recommend creating safety where there's high turnover?
Hmm. So high turnover is one of the effects of low psychological safety. So part of the business case for psychological safety is it tends to reduce turnover. People tend to stay in an environment where they feel respected and they're involved in improvement. So if there were high turnover, I mean, I think that's a problem solving A3 opportunity in and of itself to sort of try to diagnose the causes of that high turnover. How much of that is related to culture?
Right. Okay. Um, we have another question from Mark. He asks regarding psychological safety, what advice do you have for federal employees who have been actively demonized and belittled by folks at the highest level? It's really unfortunate.
It's unfortunate, and I don't uh, I don't have a good I don't have a good answer. I mean, I don't have a good answer about that in regards to psychological safety, but there seem to be um yeah, I I don't know what I have to say that could be possibly helpful there. I'm sorry that that's happening.
Sorry, too. That's really sad. There's another question. What is a good source of information for validating how psychological safety leads to higher profitability?
I think I would point to Amy Edmondson's work. I would point to Timothy Clark's work. Again, Project Aristotle, is one of those another great source. But I mean, I think we could ask the question in reverse, like, what's the argument? Like, what would be the business case for having low psychological safety? I mean, I think to me the connections are pretty clear here, and one way I sometimes try to summarize this. Let me just walk through the slide that I'd skipped real quickly. Is if we're aiming for world-class performance, I think I'm preaching to the choir here that one of the contributors would be a culture of improvement. Well, I think we can't have a culture of improvement without a culture of learning from mistakes. That's one of our key sources of improvement. Um, a culture of learning from mistakes is going to be based on a culture of psychological safety, which is based on leader behaviors, which is based upon all sorts of mindsets, and I think many Shingo principles connect there. So, I mean, I would encourage somebody go go run the experiment and see if you're doing things to improve psychological safety. I would question a hypothesis that said more psychological safety would somehow hurt our performance. To me, it seems so self-evident. I think the ROI question, I mean, this comes up with continuous improvement. Like, well, tell me the ROI of everybody in participating in daily continuous improvement. I'm like, well, what would be the argument for not having people involved in daily improvement? I don't mean to be flippant about it, but it's a short answer anyway.
Right, right. There's a question. Do you have a tool to measure psychological safety?
Yeah,
And
I mean, there are a couple of surveys out there that are a direct measurement. Amy Edmondson has a survey. Timothy Clark and his organization Leader Factor have a survey. I think there are like, for example, that's a proprietary survey that I'm a facilitator of. One benefit of using a survey like that is to have benchmarking data to compare yourself against. Amy Edmondson in her book publishes some survey questions that seem like would be free to use, but you might not have the ability to compare your scores with other organizations. But I think you can look at scores across teams, but being careful to not use it as a way to punish leaders who have lower psychological safety scores within their team, because realizing surveys are imperfect and there are factors sometimes that are outside of as much of an influence as leaders have, there are sometimes factors that are out of control, such as, let's say, if you have a lot of employees that are new to the organization, they might not yet have decided that it's psychologically safe to speak up in this workplace, right? So there are a number of variables, but I find value in doing the surveys, not just to have numbers, but to have that as a starting point for the conversation with leaders about why psychological safety might be lower than we want it to be and what we can do as leaders to boost psychological safety.
Yeah, and I just want to put a plug in for Shingo Insight. If you haven't heard about this tool, it's a way to measure your behaviors. So you can actually have that benchmark of, your base of where you're at, and you can see areas that you need to improve. And I'd be happy to send out some information to everybody regarding that as well.
Okay.
Um, let's see here. Uh,
And to people who are leaving, there was one question here. We're recording the Q&A, so we'll make this whole thing. I may ask to edit out the part where I fumbled around and was showing my calendar and all.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's see here. What have we not answered yet?
Well, there was a question. How can we retrain healthcare leaders on psychological safety? I mean, I don't know if they've ever been trained on this at all, right? And there are so many cultural habits that not just in healthcare, but if modeling the behaviors, and again, like the list I always come back to of leaders saying things like, "I was wrong about that. I made a mistake. I have an idea, but I could be wrong. So let's test it." There's a good lean problem-solving tactic there, the small test of change, to mitigate the risk of a mistake. If leaders don't have that level of humility and if not vulnerability, like they've often been taught directly or indirectly to say, well, don't ever admit you're wrong, because then you come across as a weak leader. I'm like, I think that advice is terrible advice. Employees know their leaders aren't perfect, and I think when leaders pretend to be perfect, I I think that hurts the cause. So I think people respect somebody who's willing to admit a mistake or say that they were wrong. Um, always having to have the answer is a habit that's hard to break as well. And I point to Dr. John Toussaint as one of those examples of somebody that was able to shift their mindsets and their behaviors. As I've heard John tell the story so many times, he used to be that kind of all-knowing, all-powerful, never wrong, always had the answers kind of leader. And he had good mentors from his board and from manufacturing companies who called him on it and said, you've got to behave differently. And I think that goes to make that makes a huge difference.
We have another question from Anton. He says, does psychological safety present itself as psychosocial hazard, which causes psychological harm or stress?
That's a good question. I don't know if I'm gonna lead by example and say I don't really know a good answer to that question. So I'm going to apologize, but I don't know what I would really say to that.
And another question, has AI been used yet to work with and improve psychological safety?
That's a great question. It's another one I don't have any personal experience with to know how to answer. I'm sure somebody is playing around with that. Could a leader use AI as a virtual coach around, talking about behaviors and things that we should say and not say that would either kind of boost psychological safety or detract from psychological safety? That might be one thing to play around with ChatGPT. Ask it to be a coach. It's probably not as good as a human coach, but it might be right there on your computer or on your phone when you need it.
It's an interesting concept for sure.
Mm-hmm.
There is a question about, is there a difference between addressing psychological safety in private versus public sectors?
I think no. I mean, I think it really comes back to, human dynamics, organizational dynamics, leadership behaviors. I think Amy Edmondson's research and Tim Clark's research, goes across multiple industries and different settings. And what we find is pretty universal. And I haven't been able to talk or facilitate workshops, on this subject in every country, but again, like Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, people recognize the same sort of issues about not feeling safe to speak up in the workplace. The feedback seems to be pretty consistent that the things that leaders can and must do to boost psychological safety do seem, I think, pretty universally recognized. Now, there are dynamics again where some national cultures are very seniority and hierarchy based, where you even see studies in aviation safety, where in some countries the first officer is far less likely to speak up and challenge the pilot, and that leads to the risk of accidents. So as much as aviation has worked on that pretty universally, there are some countries where you really have to make even more of an effort to create that expectation that you should speak up, but that it's safe to do so, right? So you can't just lecture people in an operating room or on a plane. Well, you should speak up. Now, if someone's life is at stake, they might be more likely to, but aviation safety history has so many situations and stories where people didn't speak up, even though their life was literally on the line on that plane. So, I think one other thing about Toyota, I think Toyota should be given a lot of credit for the andon cord and for a culture of speaking up where Japan, it seems on a whole, from what I understand, is that it is very seniority based and hierarchical. And in typical Japanese businesses, there's not that same expectation of being able to speak freely and disagree with your boss. So I think Toyota deserves even more credit for creating that culture that seems to be pretty international for them.
Along that same line, talking about Toyota, they ask if the number of core pools decline over time, do the standards, expectations change to keep problem identification, problem solving a vital part of their culture?
Yeah, I don't have exact data on that, but and I would love for somebody to be able to share that. What I would expect to happen is when you have psychological safety and problem solving, that the number of andon cord pulls would be decreasing as certain problems are put to bed somewhat permanently. Even with good mistake proofing and good standardized work in place, people still slip up. They have mental lapses. There still might be mistakes that are not perfectly mistake proofed. But then, as new parts, new models, new technologies are being introduced, that creates new opportunities for mistakes. So, I mean, it's fair to say. I asked somebody at the Toyota material handling plant in Indiana once, like, what would be the leader's response if there were zero andon cord pulls? And he said, oh, the leaders here would freak out because they wouldn't assume there were no problems. They would worry what's making people afraid to pull the andon cord. So look at how many decades Toyota has been at this. They still have near constant andon cord pulls. They still have final inspection at the end of their assembly lines. I mean, it just goes to show how hard it is to achieve perfection. But if we don't have psychological safety and problem solving, we're not going to make progress toward that.
Right. Um, this other question, some organizations measure to certain safety goals and those drive certain behaviors. What is your thoughts on implementing psychological safety in conjunction with typical safety goals such as recordable rates?
Um, so I'm trying to think through that. I'm not sure I quite understand the question or what it's getting at. Could you say that? Could you repeat that once more?
Yeah. What are your thoughts on implementing psychological safety in conjunction with typical safety goals such as recordable rates? It's the last.
Well, I don't, I mean, so if the question is what is set goals around psychological safety, probably not. I wouldn't want people to feel pressured to answer survey questions a certain way because management wants us to say we feel safe. But I would expect as the actual levels of psychological safety get better, that physical safety would improve because people feel safe pointing out safety risks. I got punished in all sorts of informal ways at General Motors as an industrial engineer for speaking up about safety risks to the frontline workers. You know, uh, as that culture changes and you feel safe pointing things out and action is being taken, I mean, I would expect a strong cause and effect relationship between higher psychological safety and better physical safety. I think back to that one quote from the Toyota Culture book. I think that's one reason those are being paired together in the way Toyota looks at this.
What if leaders don't feel psychologically safe themselves?
Yeah, we can't assume people in a senior leadership team are a high functioning team. And I've sadly been around organizations where the senior leadership team absolutely did not feel safe around the CEO. One of those organizations, whether it was true or not, and it probably was, the story gone around the organization that the CFO was fired for daring to disagree with the CEO in front of others in a meeting. So think of the chilling effect that has throughout the rest of the organization. So, I think it is possible to have a pocket of psychological safety within a team if that team is pretty well protected from the rest of the organization. But yeah, unfortunately, sadly, you could have senior leaders who don't feel that psychological safety, so they're not able to really model the behaviors that would help others feel a higher level of psychological safety. Um, I think generally, as you go higher up in an organization, there are fewer people who can punish you for speaking candidly, but there still could be somebody. It could be the CEO, it could be the board.
Um, is there a typical department that would handle psychological safety?
Uh, I mean, I think, sometimes the energy for talking about this comes from organizational development or HR. I think ideally, I mean, I don't like the idea of making this a program. um, any more than the quality department can be fully responsible for quality, or that the safety department can be fully responsible for physical safety. I think ideally this has got to be part of the culture, and I think this really has to be modeled by ideally top executives, or at least the top executives that you're ever exposed to. If they're modeling those behaviors and encouraging people to follow their lead and then rewarding people for following that lead. Like a lot of it's just, I mean, there's opportunity to provide education and coaching related to psychological safety, but I think it's really it's got to be in the direct leadership chain.
Right. What's your views on publicly recognizing people for speaking up within an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good thing. So when we talk about rewarding candor or rewarding people for speaking up, I mean, that can be as simple as a thank you individually. It could be recognition in front of a team. That could be one way of encouraging others to speak up. Healthcare has gotten better in the sense of a lot of organizations will recognize people for what they call good catches in the context of patient safety. My fear is, or my question is, what are we doing beyond catching the problem? Like, it's good to be non-punitive, but again, are we just being nice, or are we being kind and constructive and doing things to prevent the recurrence of the good catch situation? Um, but yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, celebrating situations where people did speak up, and then better yet, being able to tell the problem-solving story of here's what we learned from the mistake, here are the countermeasures that we put in place, and here's what seems to be evidence of that problem not being repeated. I think that would be an even better thing to recognize.
Absolutely. Well, lots and lots of questions. This was awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. If you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to Mark. His contact information is right there. And thank you so much for joining us today. and we'll see you again next time.
Right. Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everybody.